There is so much to discuss, but I almost want to go straight into the power of storytelling and the role of women in this space. Especially, we've seen two documentaries that are very different, but are anchored in storytelling. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think storytelling is such a powerful and integral part of Palestinian culture and has been for a very long time. And cinema has been used to tell our story and to tell our struggle, I think beginning in the 60s and 70s when the Palestinian liberation movement sort of turned the camera around and started utilizing cinema subversively to subvert dominant narratives about the freedom movement. And so that happened with the Palestine Film Unit of the PLO. They kind of showed the behind the scenes of the guerrilla warfare that was going on, the freedom struggle. And that was a really revolutionary act because it was self-representation. Palestinians have always self-represented politically, whether it was like in the Ottoman Parliament when we were still under the British mandate. But it was the first time that we were doing this visibly on a global stage. And going from there, I think is very important to understand Palestinian cinema as an extension of that storytelling. So poetry and prose are very important parts of Palestinian culture. Like if you look at the place that Ghassan Kanafani or Mahmoud Darwish or Fadwa Tuqan hold in our heritage, we're always looking for ways to express our emotions, our loss, and our longing. And film is a really, really beautiful way to do that because it's not necessarily the place to tell stories about facts and figures. When you're watching a film, it's about the texture of emotion, right? And so when Palestinian women are behind the camera now, they are also refusing to be the subjects in somebody else's telling of their story. And that's a really revolutionary thing as well. And we're seeing that more and more. We have so many Palestinian women directors out there. You have Anne-Marie Jassid, who created Wajib, which just came out this year, Salt of the Sea, When I Saw You, and she was actually just brought into the Academy in Hollywood yesterday, which is a huge move. So I think it's really about telling our own stories, being the ones to speak for ourselves. And for Palestinian women, it's also about pushing the boundaries of what it means to preserve our culture and our heritage. And I think we'll get into this in a minute, but as women in anti-colonial contexts, women often become the site of cultural preservation and cultural resistance. So this is often mapped onto us in the sense that we carry on the traditions of embroidery, like you saw in Stitching Palestine. We maintain the language, we maintain our stories, our histories, our traditional dishes, all of this, and then when you go behind the camera, you're expanding what that means, and you're moving outside of traditional gender roles as well.
Let's stay on those gender roles and unpack a little bit the characters of, especially in Stitching Palestine, because the characters are, quite diverse. But a lot of them, we see two women, I think, of the ones that are interviews actually embroidering, with their hands looking very different perhaps than the others, and their, the life that they've were able to. A lot of the other characters were either remained in Palestine or were in exile, but had managed to build quite successful life for themselves. And we see that in their homes and in the way they present themselves. And they're very different, and they have different connections to that embroidery. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you read it?
Yeah, so I think Suad Amari touched on this. I'm going to be quoting Suad a lot. I love her. But she touched on this a little bit when she referenced the class differential in Palestinian embroidery. So traditionally, Palestinian embroidery is an individual practice. It's something that before 1948 was practiced by Palestinian women in the villages, the peasants and the farmers more than anyone else. And so it was also a distinct marker of class. So if you saw someone wearing traditional Palestinian embroidery, you knew that they were from a village versus from a city. And so I thought the choice of, and now Palestinian embroidery has become a cultural artifact. It's become a marker of our national heritage because once we were displaced in 1948, and of course many remained, it became one of those things that, as Saad said, we were able to carry with us in our minds. So the things that we could carry with us when we were displaced in 48 were what we had on our backs and in our brains. We had our skills, we had our embroidery, we had our recipes, we had our language, we had our education, and those are the things that can cross borders and can also cross generations. But today, the 12 women that we saw interviewed there, most of them were upper class. And so they are from a class that does not traditionally have anything to do with embroidery. And I thought it was very, very interesting that they formed sort of like the dominant story there, because even today, even though women of all classes now will wear embroidery as a marker of their Palestinian identity, the people who are still producing it are still the most low-income Palestinian women, particularly those who are living in the refugee camps. And embroidery has been commodified in the sense that it is often looped into vocational training by international NGOs in Palestine. And in the camps elsewhere. So it's really interesting to me that something that we see as a form of cultural preservation is now also being facilitated in spaces by external actors. And women are creating this as a source of income, women who are far, far below the poverty line and will stitch for like 9 hours a day, as we saw with one of the women in the film, and then produce things like wallets or jewelry or more modern takes on embroidery, and then sell those to the upper class women or sell them to foreigners. So to me, this is a very, very interesting way to think about what cultural preservation means in that sense, and the conversation between the commodification of something that is very integral to our preservation of our culture and our identity, and how that still interacts with class.
Yes, yes. A lot of those sort of upper class women also in the movie countered a lot of the stereotypes of Palestinian women, in exile, and that was very evident. But they were, they had different connections to the embroidery, because some of them, although they didn't embroider directly, were involved in setting up sort of structures to preserve that as a way, for the heritage and the cultural heritage to continue totally. Before I turn to the audience, because we want you to get your questions in, so you should be thinking about your question as I'm turning to Nusayba for a last question, zooming out perhaps a little bit, because I know you were program and you manage the Palestinian Film and Arts Festival every year, and war and displacement and loss takes over and almost pushes an entire expression of cinema and art. And how much do you think that frames Palestinian cinema? Because this is a little bit different. And can you talk about some new narratives that are coming? We see the Lebanese civil war has ended almost 40 years ago, and Lebanese cinema is still talking about all of those non-resolved issues. We will see that in Syrian cinema for a long time as well. How much of new narratives are being sort of introduced in Palestinian cinema?
Yeah, so I think that there's always kind of a push and pull between two areas when it comes to Palestinian cinema. So on the one hand, there is a high demand for films and stories that will humanize us to external audiences, where we can explain our plight, where we can get you to empathize with us, right? And so that's one pretty dominant theme there. And then the other question to explore there is, well, what happens when we just want to tell our own stories, right? What happens when we just want to express things for ourselves? And I think this is something that many, many, many marginalized communities struggle with. If you are a creator or an artist, you are expected to tell a story that relates to your oppression. You are expected to convey that to audiences, to humanize yourself. And so one thing that we do with the DC Palestinian Film and Arts Festival is that we create a space where Palestinian artists and filmmakers can just create, right? And I think that that's very powerful and subversive in and of itself, because we are refusing to be put into boxes where we only talk about Israeli apartheid or occupation or dispossession or displacement. But in terms of like the themes that Palestinian filmmakers explore, it is everything. We have, especially within the last, I would say 7 to 10 years, you just have this beautiful mosaic of Palestinian films, ranging from everything to all of the documentaries about people's grandparents and their stories about 1948 and the Nakba, to themes like what Anne-Marie Jasset explores in her latest film, Wajib, which is a very interesting conversation about the romanticized ideas that we have about Palestine, those Palestinians of us who are living in diaspora, versus what lived reality can be like for instance, in that film specifically, Palestinian citizens of Israel who are very disenfranchised and are living as second-class citizens. And so some of these conversations are very internal Palestinian conversations that we're having through film. Sometimes they're totally navel-gazing, which is also fine because film is art and should not be looked to as the place to explore facts and figures and pack 100 years of history in.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Okay, let's turn to the room for some conversation. Do we have, yes? There is a question, yes?
Just
No?
a microphone.
No questions so far? People need more time? Maybe you and I need to speak more about Emwas and Stitching Palestine. And, oh, there's a question here.
Hi. Hi? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if Palestinian filmmakers encounter any kind of restrictions from the Israelis as to what kind of films or what something that is said or done in films is not allowed, and what would that be?
Yeah, I think that to answer that question, we need to kind of talk about where Palestinians are. And so if you are, say, I think the context that that question would apply to is if you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel and you are trying to create a film and then you are subject to...
I mean both. Both. If you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel or one in the West Bank, that is what you're saying, right?
Well, I think that, and Nihad Khadir here, she's a Palestinian filmmaker who has been working recently in the West Bank, so feel free to jump in. But I think that there is not so much Israeli censorship in the West Bank. For instance, a Palestinian can create a film and they might have trouble finding funding if they want to talk about something that's not popular, if they're talking about something that doesn't directly have to do with their oppression. But I think that that is more of an issue for Palestinian citizens of Israel who are subjected directly to the Israeli government. So for instance, if you are a student at Tel Aviv University and you want to create a film, and you could be blocked by the university's administration. But I don't know that censorship works to that overtly in that sense, because you do see Palestinian films about the whole range of ugliness of the Israeli occupation, of Israeli apartheid. And so those stories are able to get out there.
Yes, we have a question here.
Hi. Thank you so much for that beautiful film. I'm curious as to your thoughts on, so I'm a public health researcher and practitioner with a focus on gender equality and gender norms and violence and so on. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on, and it was very striking to see the footage of the female revolutionary at the beginning. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts on how the occupation has an effect on gender equality or inequality. Like, my family is from Chile, and I know that in at least some dictatorships, there's a greater incidence of men's violence against women because men are powerless outside the home, so they take it into the home. But I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that kind of dynamic.
I think that's definitely a dynamic, the one that you just named. But I also think it's important to think about political violence. And there's someone at the University of Jerusalem. I believe her name is Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, and this is her entire area of expertise. But when you're talking about like gender justice and violence against women in Palestine, you do have to look at it as inextricably intertwined with the occupation and the violence that is being inflicted on Palestinians every single day. So if we're talking about violence against Palestinian women, it comes in the form of Israeli checkpoints. It comes in the form of being denied access to healthcare because they have no freedom of movement, because Palestinian areas are denied adequate services, because Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians living in Jerusalem are also denied municipal services, and are living, most of them, well below the poverty line because of systematic disenfranchisement. And then if we're talking about like traditional gender roles, that is also something that the Israeli occupation very deliberately exploits. And this is where Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian really goes into this, because there is, for instance, if you are in an occupied area and you are a victim of domestic abuse, say you go to the Israeli authorities to report it. The Israeli authorities will twist what they say are Palestinian traditions and norms and will say, no, 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 we have to respect your culture and we have to send you back to your abuser. So this is a way that they play very, very diabolically, I will say, on these things. And so they perpetuate negative social norms, and they exacerbate them, and that is also, I think, a form of very militarized violence.
Yes, there's a question here.
Yes, it was a really fantastic documentary. I think that it's fantastic that there is a movie, a film festival every year in DC for the Palestinian movies. But I was wondering, what other ways can we have some of these movies being shown in the area, in the US? And if we do want to show some of these documentaries in schools, for example, how do we get access to some of these movies?
I would be happy to talk to you after about that, but there are a lot of films out there that are also created for educational purposes for that reason. So there's an organization in DC called Just Vision, and Just Vision creates documentary films about the situation in Palestine. They have one about Budrus, which is a village in Palestine that engaged in nonviolent resistance to move the separation wall. They actually succeeded in moving it like 300 meters. It was cutting them off from their land. They have films about settlements in East Jerusalem, and they recently just released a film called Naila and the Uprising, which is about the role of women in the 1987 Intifada. And they're a great resource because with all of these films, which they create as community education tools, they come with curriculums, and they are happy to facilitate discussions in communities. But there are also a lot of good resources online. There is a Palestinian film library. I don't remember the exact URL right now, but it puts a lot of these films up for use for screening in your communities, and there's a plethora of resources. And the Jerusalem Fund, thank you, Huda. The Jerusalem Fund in DC, the Palestine Center, is also a great resource. They hold talks weekly about this sort of thing and screen films frequently. They do a film series every summer as well.
And the ICE Arts and Program, Arts
There we
and Culture
go.
Program. We have screened these part of our program. We hope to screen more Palestinian and other sort of Arab films in the future. And that is always, students are welcome to come and watch these movies for free. Any other questions? Yes, there is a question here.
I don't have a question. I just want to say, kind of to challenge our thinking a little bit regarding men and women. I always try to encourage people to remember that all political violence is violence against women, because it directly impacts half of the society, which is women, and then the other half, which is the brothers, the children,
sons,
the husbands, right? The fathers, whomever it is. And so all political violence, number one, is violence against women. And then the second thing I want to say about the Palestinian filmmakers, all Palestinians are subject to the same forms of violence. So whether they're in the diaspora, Jerusalem, inside of the 48 territories in the West Bank, in Gaza, they're all subject. I mean, it's right. What's called the matrix of control. So they look like different the violence looks different, but any Palestinian filmmaker is subject to all of those forms of violence, whether it's at the border or at the checkpoint or whatever it is. And I think it was Hani Abu Asad's film Omar. He made that one after going through some really bizarre paranoia, making his other, what was the other film called?
Paradise Now.
So that film came out of paranoia regarding informants and the Israeli state and all of those kinds of things. And so that would be a good example of a film to watch that sort of lends a vision to that type of violence that happens with filmmakers in particular.
And she didn't introduce
there's
herself,
a question.
but
Yeah.
this is Nihad Khadar, who is one of the founding curators of the DC Palestinian Film and Arts Festival. So if you want an expert, there she is.
We have a question in the back.
Actually, it's a comment. Thank you a lot for the movie. It's really interesting. I'm Palestinian from Jerusalem. I'm currently here to pursue my master's. The movie made me feel a bit homesick, seeing home and like listening to the stories like my aunt and my grandparents' stories. About the violence, it's not only for the filmmakers, it's even for every individual. Even, for example, if I want to post on the social media, it depends where you live. For example, I live in Jerusalem, and when I will go back to the airport, for example, they can track everything that you publish, and like there's no real freedom. There's no right of freedom of expression. Even like the media is targeted, not even filmmakers. So like we lack freedom, and that's what occupation is. It's really sad, even about like the woman that you mentioned. It's one of the sad things that I really see, and it hurts me a lot. For example, there's like sexual harassment, and it happens even at the checkpoints from the soldiers. And if women want to stand up or speak, they might be killed on spot, and they say, oh, it's security reasons. So, and I understand there's like no freedom, and there's a lack of fairness, and that's occupation. I hope we will have peace, and I'm glad like these movies can like give a lens to what is really happening, and I invite everyone to come and visit Palestine. And thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes. If there aren't any burning questions on the floor, I can turn to you and say, you know, in both film, Emwas and Stitching Palestine, this burning sort of yearning of, yes, I want to go back, yes, I want to return. And you know, people sometimes return in dreams and sometimes through embroidery, and in Emwas they return through the yearly trip that they organize, and they go to see this paradoxical Canadian park that is now where the village was. And you know, you also see the people who haven't left, you know, who also's lives are shattered because they're divided and they can't even, you know, put their lives together. So there isn't, you know, nobody's winning in this situation. How, you know, how do you read this? How did this come across to you in the movies?
So in the beginning of Stitching Palestine, there's a line that says, in 1948, Palestine became a nation the size of a planet. And I think that encompasses it all, because in 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes. They were exiled. And today, that number, the number of Palestinian refugees officially is 5 million. And so those include refugees in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and then elsewhere in the world. There's a total of 7 million of us in exile. And the refrain, the constant refrain of Palestinians, no matter where we are in the world, is return. And we've been seeing that recently even more. We saw it in the Great Return March in Gaza, which is still ongoing. It began on April 30th, and it was a mass demonstration at the boundary with Israel, the boundary of the Gaza Strip with Israel, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians gathered to demand the right to return to their homes, to their villages, which for many of them were only a few miles away. And I want to that I think has been in the news a lot lately, especially the really brutal Israeli response to that. There were Israeli snipers who've killed upwards of 130 Palestinian demonstrators, medics, who were demanding their internationally sanctioned right of return. And it's also, the Great Return March was not something that was new. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not a new method of Palestinian resistance. I want to say the Palestinians have been utilizing nonviolent resistance since the 1920s, since like the 1919 King Crane Commission came to Palestine to kind of survey the land and be like, should we partition it or should we not? Palestinians said no. And then they enacted all these forms of civil disobedience at that time, and that tradition has been continuing till today. And return isn't just relegated to the Gaza Strip. We also look at present absentees within the state of Israel. So those are Palestinians that were internally displaced in 1948 and live one village away, one city away from their homes. And they have become a Kafkaesque category of present absentees, which means they are there, but they are not there. And because they weren't in their homes in 1950, Israel could expropriate all of their land. And every year, for the past 18 years, Palestinian citizens of Israel have marched for their right of return. And you also see the same thing happening in the West Bank. You see that happening in diaspora. And so that really speaks to how closely we hold on to our connection to the land. And I think we saw that through all of the characters in these films. There was such a strong sense of not just longing and nostalgia, but belonging. Like, we all know that that's home. And that shows to us, again, that like Palestine is not just a place, it's also a lived experience. It's also, it's a state of being. And again, it's something that we can carry with us, even though we should and we do have the right of return.
Thank you, Nusayba. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for everybody who's come out to watch those wonderful movies. Stay tuned to our programs and have a good night. Thank you. Thank you so much.